This is a 2018 Polaris Slingshot, and it really is one of the craziest vehicles you can buy. For one thing, just look at it. They call it a motorcycle, but you can sit in it, and it has a steering wheel and seat belts. But it's not a car because it has no doors and no roof and only 3 wheels. What it really is insane, and today I'm going to review it. I've borrowed this Slingshot from CNC Motors, which is an exotic car dealership here in Southern California that has a truly amazing inventory of everything from old vintage SUVs and trucks to multi-million-dollar exotic supercars to weird stuff like the Slingshot. They have an incredible showroom, and you can check out their inventory by clicking the link in the description below. So let's talk Slingshot. These came out for the 2015 model year, and the starting price is around $20,000 if you buy one new. It's sort of a cross between a car and a motorcycle, and in fact, in most states, it's classified as an auto cycle, which means you can drive it with a regular driver's license and you don't need a special motorcycle license. That makes sense because it certainly isn't operated like a traditional motorcycle. For one thing, you sit in it. Although in is a bit of a stretch because it doesn't have doors or windows or a roof, but it is set up like a car with a steering wheel and seats and pedals, and it even has a car engine, a 175 horsepower 2.4 liter 4-cylinder borrowed from General Motors, the same engine in the Chevy Cobalt and the Pontiac Solstice. But I wouldn't exactly call it a car either because it has 3 wheels, and I mean, look at it. I don't really know how to classify this thing, which is precisely why I need to review it. So today I'm going to do just that. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of the Slingshot, and I'm going to show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Ded Score. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Slingshot with a brief discussion of what it is. Now, it's manufactured by Polaris, which is a company that's mainly known for snowmobiles, ATVs, off-roaders, that sort of thing, but now they have this, which is a little bit more suitable to driving on the street. Now, the Slingshot has 2 seats, as you can see, and it has 3 wheels. You have 2 wheels up front and 1 center-mounted wheel in the back. And of course, you also have this daring, kind of attention-grabbing styling, which is pretty cool, or kind of excessive, depending on your point of view. Now, these Slingshots have become popular in warm areas that don't get much weather. They sell a roof, but it's not how this should be enjoyed. So you see them a lot in Southern California, and then in the winter in Florida, Arizona, that kind of thing. That's where they're most common. As for how the Slingshot is used, I think the theory is it's more practical than a motorcycle, but it still gives you kind of the same open-air, fast driving thrill. And they're not all that expensive. Like I said, they start at 20 grand new. This one is a couple years old, and it's even cheaper. That's a pretty good bargain for something that's so fun and so head-turning. But moving on from a general overview to a few of the basics of the Slingshot, one is the fact that it's rear-wheel drive. Even though there's only a single wheel back here, this is the drive wheel. It is very much rear-wheel drive and not rear wheels drive. And next up, we move on to the front, and I want to talk about the powertrain, but first, I want to talk about opening the hood because it's a rather unusual process. Right here under the Slingshot logo in front, you have a little latch. You push that latch down, and then the hood, the engine cover, is released. Now, it's forward hinged, so usually that means you go to the back and open it up, but not in the case of the Slingshot. Instead, you pull from the front, and then you can kind of pull it down and forward, and that opens it up and gives you access to the engine. Very unusual for a front hinged hood. And next up, now that we're under the hood, I want to talk about the engine because this is a rather odd one. Like I mentioned, this is a 2.4 liter 4-cylinder that was borrowed from General Motors. This is the same engine in the Chevy Cobalt and in the base model version of the Saturn Sky and the Pontiac Solstice, and it makes about 175 horsepower. Now, that may not sound all that impressive because the Cobalt versions that use this engine weren't exactly high-performance, exciting cars, but this weighs only about 1,750 pounds. So it's a lot lighter than the Cobalt, and that very much transforms the driving experience, even if you have the Cobalt's engine. And next up, before I climb inside, another rather important detail. Like I mentioned, this is classified as an auto cycle in most states, meaning you don't need a motorcycle license to drive it. But that also means that it kind of bridges the gap between automobile and motorcycle in terms of regulations, and it doesn't have to qualify for all the same regulations a typical car does. For instance, there's no windshield. Well, there is kind of a windshield, but not really. That's all you get in this thing. There's also no airbags because an auto cycle apparently doesn't need airbags, even though they're mandatory on cars sold here in North America. And next up, here's another one that I love. I've told you in many videos that headlights and taillights on North American cars have to be on a fixed piece. They can't be on something movable because then when you move it, you won't be able to see them. In the Slingshot, that remains true. The headlights are on a fixed piece, but you can see that when the hood is open, the hood is blocking the headlights completely, which kind of defeats the spirit of that regulation, but nonetheless this thing complies technically. But there are many more regulations that the Slingshot doesn't comply with, and that's proven the moment you get inside because there's a decal right in the center console that specifically says, "This vehicle does not conform to the requirements of the dynamic or static tests set out in this motor vehicle safety standard." Now, I don't know what exactly that safety standard is, but it's a little disconcerting when you get into a vehicle and the very most prominent label is one that tells you it doesn't comply with certain safety standards. Interesting. Now, next up, another thing you notice immediately when you climb inside in that area is the transmission, because this is a manual. Now, the Slingshot came out for the 2015 model year, like I mentioned, and they were all manuals until now. They are just finally coming out with an automatic for 2020, but all the earlier Slingshots, you needed 3 pedals and a true manual transmission. But anyway, next it comes time to start the Slingshot, and the key is rather unusual. It looks like a regular key, but the Slingshot logo is this absurd, like, triangle thing. It looks like an 80s metal band logo, but that's what they've gone with here. Very strange key. But the starting procedure is relatively similar to a lot of other cars. You just stick the key in the steering column in the normal place, you turn it, and then you have to push the starter button. In this vehicle, the starter button is rather unusually labeled. It's this big red button in the center with an arrow and a lightning bolt on it for some reason, and it lights up when you turn the car into the accessories position so you know what to press. Anyway, you press that and the Slingshot comes to life. And next up, another interesting control in the Slingshot is over to the left of the steering wheel, where you have the turn signal stalk. Interesting for 2 reasons. One is because it's borrowed from the Volvo 850, which was sold from 93 to 97 here in North America, and for some reason the Slingshot carries on its legacy with the same signal stalk. The other interesting thing about this signal stalk is that it has controls on it for cruise control. You can see on, off, resume, set. All your cruise controls are on there. So does the Slingshot actually have cruise control? Yes, it does. Not adaptive cruise control, won't speed up or slow down, but there's cruise control in this little thing. Pretty crazy. And next up, another notable item in here is another warning label that I absolutely love. It's in the middle between the seats, and it says, "Warning, this is a motorcycle." You keep going down and it says, "Driver must be at least 16. Occupants must be able to sit with back against the seat and feet firmly on the floorboards." This is the equivalent of a "you must be at least this tall to ride this ride" sign that you see at amusement parks. Except here it is inside the vehicle that you own. I find that to be hilarious, but I guess they had to put it in there for safety reasons. Still pretty funny. Now, the next thing you know when you're sitting in this car, motorcycle, auto vehicle, is that everything in here is pretty crappy. Nothing is really all that nice in this interior, but there's a reason for that. This is open topped, and even though they sell one with a roof, it still isn't exactly enclosed. So everything here has to be durable enough to get rained on if you accidentally leave it outside or you get caught in a rainstorm. So everything is kind of a durable plastic. You have a plastic steering wheel in here. You have a plastic gear lever. Doesn't really feel as nice as a leather one, but it's necessary for the type of vehicle this is. And the parking brake is also plastic, kind of crappy looking, but again, it's essential for what this is. And it's the same deal with the seats. You don't have nice leather seats with power adjustment in here. Instead, you have these fairly simple seats with this durable fabric on them in case you get caught out in a rainstorm and the seats get wet. You wouldn't want them to get damaged. Now, as for the technology in this vehicle, there's not really all that much, although you do have a center screen. You can see it's flanked by 4 buttons on the left, 4 on the right, and it says Slingshot in huge print on the bottom. But this screen has pretty limited functionality. You can see over on the right, the button on the bottom will change the mode you're in, so AM, FM, Bluetooth, the stereo mode, that sort of thing. Above that, you have a few other buttons to adjust the radio. You can see tune, plus or minus to scroll through different radio stations, and you can also scroll through presets below that. Now over on the left, a few more buttons, also fairly simple. On the bottom, you have the phone. You can hook up Bluetooth to this and then talk on the phone while you're driving in your open air Slingshot. I'm sure that will be very pleasant for whoever you're calling. And you also have your volume controls here. Unfortunately, volume is buttons that you tap rather than a dial, which is very annoying, but that's what they've decided to do. Now below that screen in the center, I already showed you the engine starter button, but below that you have 4 switches, 2 of which are blank, which makes me wonder what kind of luxuries are we missing out on in this Slingshot. But below that, the other 2 switches are active. The one on the left will turn on and off traction control, pretty standard, and the one on the right will turn on and off the hazard lights in case you become a hazard in your Slingshot. And next up, another interesting item in this center console area, you have cup holders. And not just 1, but 2, plural, cup holders, so you can drive around with a nice little beverage as you drive your Slingshot. They've really thought of all the stuff that truly matters. Strangely though, there is a warning label that says you need to wear a full helmet while driving this vehicle. You can clearly see there's even an image of what the helmet should look like. When you're wearing one of those, you can't easily drink. So why include cup holders? I think Polaris realizes most people are gonna ignore that whole helmet thing. And next up, we move on to the gauge cluster. A couple of notable items in here. One is this little black button kind of on the top of the steering column. If you press that, it will cycle through various different vehicle information displays on your left gauge cluster screen. It'll show you your mileage, your fuel economy, your range, all of that sort of stuff in case you want to check on any of those things while you're driving. To me, though, the more interesting and hilarious item in the gauge cluster is the fact that the speedometer goes up to 220 miles an hour. Admittedly, the numbers above 120 start to get smaller, but still, that's probably the most optimistic speedometer I've ever seen. Can you imagine going 220 in a 3-wheeled vehicle with no windshield and the engine from a Chevy Cobalt? It's probably not gonna happen. And next up, another interesting item in the Slingshot. If you're thinking interior storage, there's really not much, and you wouldn't really expect that because all the usual places like door panels don't exist in here. But you do have a glove box over on the passenger side, right where the glove box is in basically every other car. You can open this up and put documents or paperwork in there that you need. And next up, one other item you don't have in here is a rear view mirror. You do have rear view mirrors on the outside, just like basically every other vehicle. They're manual and you kind of just press on them to adjust them, but you don't have a center rear view mirror since there's no windshield or ceiling to mount it on. So you really have to come to rely on those wing mirrors on the outside or just kind of looking over your shoulder since it's not like there's much body work blocking your visibility. And next up, moving back outside the Slingshot, there are a few more notable items I want to point out in back, one of which is the brake lights. They just look so cool and distinctive and interesting, kind of coming off of the bodywork like this. And you can also see the turn signals here right next to the brake lights also have a very distinctive look. You won't mistake this for anything else, not that you would anyway. My very favorite piece of lighting back here, though, is the third brake light. It's right in the middle, and you can see, unlike other third brake lights, it's vertical. It kind of points straight up from the back of the vehicle towards the passenger compartment, and it just looks really cool. It's a nice creative way to get a third brake light into this rather inhospitable design. And by the way, since I'm around back, it's worth noting that the fuel cap is back here. It's on this piece of bodywork behind the driver's seat, this little circle. You just twist this little cap, it opens up, and that's where you put fuel in your Slingshot. By the way, one other interesting lighting related item with the Slingshot, you go into the interior and you won't find a switch to turn on the headlights. There's no button, no switch, no lever. Nothing. This baffled me. How do you turn on the headlights in this thing? And then I realized they're always on. Every time you turn on the Slingshot, the lights go on with it. And actually, you can see the headlights are labeled next to the ignition switch, showing which headlight turns on with which ignition switch position. It's rather interesting. Now, as for the headlights themselves, there are 4 of them. You have 2 on the outsides, like a normal car, and then you have 2 more circles in the middle. So you have kind of 4 headlights in a very distinctive headlight shape. If you want the brights to come on, the high beams, you pull back on the turn signal stalk, and that lights up the middle headlights even more for a high beam projection, like in a normal car, except in the center. And finally, one more notable item around back is the license plate. Now, like I keep saying, this is classified as an auto cycle in most states, but it gets a motorcycle license plate. But like I've been saying, most states you don't need a motorcycle license to drive it. It's a bit of a conundrum in terms of regulation, but even a regular person like me can drive this thing. So, time to do that. But first, I have to get inside. Although I will say, getting in and out of this is a lot easier than some of the other open cockpit racy road cars I've reviewed, like the Ariel Atom and the BAC Mono. Allow me to demonstrate. Getting in is really pretty simple. You just kind of put your feet over, put your butt down, and you're in. You're sitting on the seat and you're ready to go. Getting out is a little bit more difficult, but really not all that much harder. You just kind of climb out and you're ready. It's pretty simple. Getting in and out of this thing, really not that big of a deal. And so those are the quirks and features of the Polaris Slingshot. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Slingshot. Now you're supposed to wear a helmet in this thing for 2 reasons. One is a safety reason, because it's very open and it's kind of like a motorcycle. And the other is just pure comfort because there's no windshield, and so there's a lot of wind. But I would say where I live, I see one of these probably every week or so, and most people aren't wearing helmets. You're supposed to, but... And plus, I daily drive my convertible Land Rover with not much safety protection over me, and I feel okay about it. I wouldn't drive this more than a little bit with no helmet, though, for the comfort issue alone. It feels nice and usable and fun. Easy to rev match, easy to clutch in and out, shifter doesn't feel rubbery. It's nice. You do feel unusually open in this thing, which is of course because you are, but I mean, no doors, you can see the road right next to you, you can just kind of reach out and the whole world is around. It's a little bit of a disconcerting feeling, to be totally honest. But I'm gonna step on it here. There's a lot of wind. A helmet might be nice if you plan on, I'm only going to drive this thing a little bit around sort of low-speed roads. If you plan on actually driving it, a helmet is absolutely crucial, I think, to the experience. In terms of steering and handling, this is actually more exciting than I was expecting it to be. It's a lot of fun to throw it around. The steering is pretty tight. There's a little more body roll than I was thinking there would be given its size and weight, and I suspect that's because there's no 2 back wheels to stabilize it, so the car kind of moves a little bit more than you'd think it would. I actually find this to be a ton of fun. It's not something I would want to do often, and I don't love being so exposed. There's certainly a safety risk there, especially in a vehicle that'll do 220. I will say one downside for me is the powertrain. Even though 170 horsepower in a vehicle this size should make it move pretty well, and it does, it's pretty quick, the engine is not an aggressive one. This was not a sports car motor. It's a kind of average 4-cylinder. And so it's not like you access more power by getting high in the rev range. It's not like it's tremendously exciting or aggressive or thrilling as you accelerate. It's fine. It's relatively quick, but there's just not that much drama to it. Sitting in here is not as uncomfortable as I expected it to be. Because no helmet, I'm getting a lot of wind rush, but the seat actually feels nice. You have a pretty good amount of room, and I'm fairly tall. My legs are okay, my knees are okay. And getting in and out, as I demonstrated, is not really all that hard. It's not really a daily usable vehicle. But it's fun. And so that's the Polaris Slingshot. Call it a car, call it a motorcycle, whatever. It's ridiculous. It's open, it's crazy looking, it's uncomfortable, it's bizarre. I would never own this thing, but for the right person, it is absolutely perfect. And I'm glad they made it because I love weird stuff like this. And I'm thrilled I finally got the chance to check out the Slingshot. And now it's time to give this thing a Ded Score.
And the Ded Score is 51 out of 100, with a much higher showing in the weekend categories than the daily scores as expected. Here's the Slingshot compared to rivals, and you can see where it lands, far behind the BAC Mono and the Aerial Atom, which are considerably more focused track cars. The Slingshot is really just for fun, and it's good at that, earning a fun factor of 9 out of 10, higher than the NA Mazda Miata. Where the Slingshot falters, of course, is practicality, features, comfort, but that's to be expected. No one is going to use one of these as their only vehicle. As a fun weekend toy, however, it's surprisingly quick and really exciting given the top-down open-air driving experience. Personally, I would rather have a Miata, considering that it's more usable, but the Slingshot is definitely more thrilling, given that it's faster and just more insane and weird and head-turning. Overall, this is a cool car motorcycle thing that's a lot of fun in very limited circumstances.